Pack your things. Camille didn't look up from her phone when she said it. Isaiah's suitcase was already by the door. She had packed it herself, which told him everything about how long she had been planning this moment. She set her phone down, straightened her blazer, and looked at him the way someone looks at a contract they've decided not to renew. No anger, no apology. Just the calm efficiency of a woman closing a chapter she had already moved on from weeks ago. Isaiah didn't argue. He picked up his box of blueprints and walked out into the New Orleans night without a word. 2 days later, Camille was mid-celebration when she looked up at the television and went completely still. Isaiah was standing on a stage before the entire city, introduced as the lead architect, holding final approval over every decision tied to her $23 million deal. She had thrown out the wrong man. If you're new here, this channel is where we tell the stories people don't talk about enough. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. To everyone who knew them as a couple, Isaiah Hollowell was the quiet one. That detail matters not as a character flaw, but as the condition that made everything that followed possible. He was the man in the background of Camille's world, present enough to be taken for granted, unremarkable enough to be dismissed, and quietly capable of things that no one around her had thought to ask about. He taught structural design part-time at Crescent Parish Technical College, drove a 2011 Civic with a cracked dashboard, and had a habit of arriving at parties and leaving without anyone noticing either. Camille's colleagues had long since stopped asking much about him. He was simply there the way a support beam is there unremarked upon until something goes wrong. What none of them knew, and what Isaiah had quietly arranged for none of them to know, was that he had spent the better part of 15 years being one of the most precise architectural minds working in historic preservation in the Gulf South. He had founded Hollowell Civic Studio in his late 20s, taken on projects that larger firms wouldn't touch, crumbling opera houses, flood-damaged courthouses, churches whose congregations had more faith than funding, and restored them with a level of craft that earned him a reputation in very specific circles. Not famous circles, the kind where people knew what they were looking at. After his mother died and the distance in his marriage began to feel less like a phase and more like a direction, Isaiah stepped back from the studio. He took a teaching position to be home more to give Camille's career room to breathe during a period when Davenport Heritage Builders was just beginning to find its footing. He kept taking on design work under a professional code quietly, the way a man maintains a habit he's not ready to give up entirely. He just stopped talking about it. In the early years of Camille's company, Isaiah was the one who stayed up past midnight fixing the language in her bid proposals, who flagged the structural inconsistencies in subcontractors' drawings before they became expensive mistakes, who called in favors from craftsmen he'd worked with for years to get her projects staffed with people who actually understood what historic materials required. There were nights Camille would fall asleep at her desk and wake to find that Isaiah had not only made coffee, but had rewritten 3 pages of a submission that was due at 9 in the morning. She would read it and know in the clear-eyed way she had about most things that it was better than what she had written. She would submit it without changing a word. Those were the years when she would reach across the seat of his old car and squeeze his hand without saying anything. The years when she would ask him what he saw when they walked down Esplanade Avenue at night, and then actually listen as he talked about the way a cornice line could tell you everything about who built a structure and what they believed about the people who would one day stand beneath it. Isaiah loved New Orleans the way a person loves a language they learned before they learned to speak in the bones without translation. And for a while, Camille loved it through him. But companies grow, and as Davenport Heritage Builders grew, the version of Isaiah that Camille carried in her mind began to quietly update itself. The man who had rewritten her proposals became in memory a man who had helped with some paperwork. The craftsmen he'd called in became contacts she'd cultivated. The nights he'd worked beside her blurred into a general impression of early struggle that she'd powered through on her own. This wasn't dishonesty exactly. It was the way success rewrites its own origin story, smoothing over the parts that don't fit the narrative a person needs in order to keep moving forward. Brett Chandler arrived when the company was already profitable, and Camille was already tired of explaining Isaiah at events. Brett was the kind of man who understood immediately what a room needed from him and delivered it without appearing to try. He came on as Chief Operating Officer with a roster of investor relationships and a way of standing next to Camille at functions that made them look like they had built something together. He was polished in the specific way that money and ambition polish a person, and he understood within about 3 conversations that the most effective way to get what he wanted from Camille was to give her language for something she had already been feeling. What Brett wanted, though, Camille would not understand this until much later, had nothing to do with her. He had identified Davenport Heritage Builders as a vehicle, a company with legitimate licensing established subcontractor networks, and a reputation clean enough to attach to a $23 million public trust project without raising immediate flags. What he needed was access to that vehicle, and the fastest way to get access was to remove the one person who might look at his numbers carefully enough to ask the right questions. Isaiah, even operating quietly in the background, was that person. So Brett got ahead of it. He never said anything directly negative about Isaiah. He was too careful for that. He would make an observation. "You've built something real here, Camille, and you deserve a partner who matches that energy," and let her fill in the rest herself. He asked once in a tone of genuine curiosity whether Isaiah had ever considered doing something more with his career. He mentioned almost as an aside that optics mattered in their industry, that clients made judgments about leadership based on what they saw at a table. He planted seeds carefully and let the ground do the work. Camille, who was exhausted and ambitious and quietly lonely in a marriage that had slowly stopped requiring much of either of them, was fertile ground. The affair began in that space not from passion but from a dissatisfaction that Brett had spent months deliberately cultivating. The Gulf Crescent Cultural Trust announced the Marigny Crown Theater restoration project in early spring. The theater had been a landmark in the Marigny neighborhood since the late 1800s. Its arched ceiling, carved mahogany balconies, and hand-laid mosaic floors had survived decades of neglect and 2 major hurricanes before the third one finally tore the roof and drove water through every floor. The total project budget was $23 million. The selection process was divided into 2 completely separate phases: an anonymous design competition judged by an independent panel, and a public bidding process for the construction contract kept entirely apart to prevent any single firm from controlling both. Isaiah had been studying the Marigny Crown for 7 years. He submitted his design under the professional code he used for all his independent work, H17, without telling Camille, without telling anyone. It was not a secret exactly. It simply hadn't come up in the way that things don't come up between 2 people who have stopped asking each other questions. Davenport Heritage Builders won the construction bid in early fall. The announcement came on a Tuesday evening, and by 9 o'clock, Camille had transformed their Garden District home into a celebration that Isaiah knew nothing about. He came back from the university to find the driveway full of cars and the living room full of people holding glasses of wine, investors, attorneys, the company's senior staff, and Brett Chandler standing at the center of it all with his hand resting at the small of Camille's back, as though he had always lived there. Isaiah stood in the doorway of his own home for a moment before anyone noticed him. A woman from Camille's legal team eventually touched his arm and congratulated him, and he thanked her without knowing exactly what he was being congratulated for. When Camille gave her remarks, she thanked her team by name. She thanked Brett for believing in her vision when the road ahead wasn't clear. The room applauded. Isaiah stood near the back with a glass of water and watched his wife describe the architecture of her success without placing him anywhere inside it. After the guests left, Camille was still in her blazer going through something on her phone. Brett had stepped out to make a call. Isaiah asked if they could talk. What followed was not an argument. Arguments require 2 people who both believe the outcome is still uncertain. Camille had already decided, and she delivered the decision with the composure of someone who had been preparing for this particular meeting for quite some time. She said she wanted a divorce. She said she had reached a level in her career that required her to be surrounded by people who matched it. She said she was tired of feeling embarrassed. Isaiah asked if she was certain she wanted to end 12 years of marriage on the same night she'd celebrated the biggest contract of her career. Especially tonight, Camille said. Brett came back inside and didn't leave again. That detail closed the door on anything Isaiah might have said next. He went to the study, picked up the wooden box where he kept his architectural drawings, and walked out through the front door without another word. He drove to his father's house on the other side of the city. Otis Hollowell was a retired restoration carpenter who had spent 4 decades working with his hands on buildings that other people designed, and who had the kind of unhurried wisdom that comes from spending a lifetime paying close attention to how things are actually put together. He was awake when Isaiah arrived. Otis was almost always awake, and he made coffee without asking questions. He sat down across from his son and said that a building doesn't collapse on the day you first notice the cracks. It collapses because the cracks were ignored for long enough that the structure beneath them quietly failed. Then he didn't say anything else, which was exactly the right amount. Isaiah went through the wooden box that night and realized that several folders connected to the Marigny Crown Theater project were missing. He checked his cloud storage and found what he was looking for. Brett had accessed his shared design folder 6 weeks earlier during a period when Camille had given him administrative credentials to the household network. Several of Isaiah's preliminary sketches had been copied. Some of the structural analysis in Davenport's winning bid had language that matched Isaiah's research notes closely enough to be unmistakable. He kept reading. He found a chain of emails between Camille and a private attorney outlining a divorce strategy. Undervalue the shared property. Classify Isaiah's contributions to the company as informal and uncompensated. Obtain his signature on a settlement that would leave him with a modest lump sum and no claim over any intellectual property. The emails were dated 3 weeks before the contract announcement. Brett's name did not appear in them, but his logic was visible in every line. His phone rang just after 2 in the morning. It was Regina Fontenot, chair of the Gulf Crescent Cultural Trust. She told him that the identity of the architect behind Design H17 would be publicly announced in 2 days in a live broadcast from the Trust's offices. She wanted to confirm he would be present. Isaiah said he would be there. He sat in his father's kitchen for another hour without moving. He thought about 12 years. He thought about the version of himself that had made himself smaller year after year because he had believed that was what love sometimes required. After a long while, he picked up his phone and began making calls. On the morning of the second day, Isaiah ironed the one good suit he'd brought with him and borrowed his father's iron. Otis watched him from the doorway of the bedroom and didn't say a word because there was nothing left to say. His son was done making himself small. The Gulf Crescent Cultural Trust had reserved a ballroom at the Pontchartrain Hotel for the announcement, and Regina Fontenot had insisted on doing it properly. Live broadcast, full press presence, the kind of event that reminded the city that public architecture was worth treating as a civic occasion. The cameras went out across 3 local channels at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, which was how Camille came to be watching the broadcast from the new Davenport Heritage Builders office on Magazine Street, seated beside Brett with a glass of sparkling water and the particular confidence of a woman who expects to see her own name reflected back at her from the news. She had spent the morning fielding congratulatory calls. Several profiles were in progress at local publications: the self-made CEO, the historic preservation visionary, the woman behind New Orleans' most significant restoration project in a decade. She had approved a new headshot for the occasion. She was, by any reasonable measure, at the highest point of everything she had worked toward. On screen, Regina Fontenot stood at a podium in front of an image of the Marigny Crown Theater, the cracked facade, the collapsed roof section, the water-stained interior. She spoke about the theater's history, about the Trust's responsibility, about the unanimous decision of the independent review panel. She said the selected design had distinguished itself not only by its technical precision, but by its demonstrated understanding of what the building had actually been. Then she said the name of the architect. Camille set down her glass. Isaiah walked onto that stage in his father's borrowed, carefully pressed suit and stood at the podium as if he had always belonged there, which Regina made clear in her introduction. He had. founder of Hollowell Civic Studio, 15 years in historic preservation, sole author of Design H, 17. Appointed independent design director for the Marini Crown Theater project, with contractual authority over all material selections, structural modifications, subcontractor approvals, and payment disbursements. Every financial decision tied to the $23 million contract would require his sign-off before it moved forward. Brett reached over and turned off the television. "He set us up," Brett said, his voice controlled but with something calculating running beneath it. "He used your company to position himself, and now he's using that position against us." Camille didn't answer. She was still looking at the blank screen. What moved through her mind in that moment was not strategy. It was a single specific memory she hadn't thought about in years. A phone call she had overheard once early in the company's life when Isaiah was in the next room talking to a preservation engineer in Baton Rouge. She hadn't been listening closely, but she remembered the quality of his voice assured exact the voice of someone completely at home in the material, and she remembered thinking without letting the thought go any further that she had no idea what he was actually talking about. She had closed the door and gone back to her desk. She had done that she understood now because understanding it would have required her to reckon with something she wasn't ready to reckon with. The press found the connection within hours. By evening, 2 news programs had led with the story the lead architect of New Orleans' most prominent restoration project was the estranged husband of the construction company's CEO. Brett moved quickly. Through a contact in local media, he pushed a specific narrative that Isaiah had deliberately concealed his involvement in the design competition to engineer a situation where his wife's company would win a contract he could then use as leverage in their divorce. It was internally consistent, and it had the particular advantage of being just plausible enough to take hold before anyone examined it carefully. The trust requested a meeting. Regina Fontenot sat across from Isaiah in a conference room and asked him to walk through the full timeline. Isaiah laid out the submission records, the date stamps on his design files, the anonymization protocol the trust itself had administered. The competition had been managed by an independent panel with no access to competitor identities. Isaiah had not known Davenport Heritage Builders was bidding. The documentation was unambiguous. What it could not immediately fix was the story already in circulation. A reporter outside the trust's offices asked Isaiah directly whether he intended to use his approval authority to obstruct Davenport Heritage Builders in retaliation for the divorce. Isaiah stood in the afternoon light and gave his answer without any visible irritation. He said the Marini Crown Theater did not belong to him or to Camille. It belonged to the Marini neighborhood, and to every resident who had watched it deteriorate for years, while the money and the will to fix it failed to arrive at the same time. He said he would not damage that project because his marriage had failed. His conditions were straightforward: full cost auditing, no substitution of historic materials, retention of local craftsmen, clear intellectual property documentation, and a review of all consulting and supply contracts. Then he went back inside. The auditors the trust appointed were thorough and efficient. What they found in the subcontractor agreements took less than a week to surface. 3 contracts, 1 for structural consulting, 1 for specialty material sourcing, 1 for project management oversight, were priced significantly above market rates. The companies named in those contracts shared a registered agent. That agent connected through 2 holding entities incorporated in Delaware to a private operations firm called Chandler Field Management. Chandler Field Management was controlled by Brett. The numbers told a story that was almost elegant in its simplicity. Brett had never intended to run a construction project. He had intended to run an extraction. Davenport Heritage Builders was the mechanism, a legitimate firm whose contract would provide cover for a network of inflated subcontracts that would redirect several $1 million into entities he controlled before anyone looked closely enough at the line items. He had needed the company to win the bid. He had needed Isaiah out of the picture. He had arranged both. The audit findings were transmitted to the trust board on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Brett had seen them through a contact inside the process, and by Thursday, he had begun to move. What Brett did next was careful and nearly effective. He had saved over months a selection of internal emails, routine communications between Isaiah and Camille from the period when Isaiah occasionally weighed in on the company's project pipeline. A contact altered the document metadata. The emails, when finished, appeared to show Isaiah discussing the Crown Theater bid with Camille while the design competition was still in progress, which would have meant he had known his wife's company was a competitor, which would have constituted exactly the kind of conflict the trust's process was designed to prevent. Brett sent the altered documents to 3 journalists and to the office of a city council member who had already expressed concern about the project. By the time Isaiah's attorneys identified the specific alterations, a timestamp inconsistency, a mail server header that didn't match the email client's formatting, the story had already run. Isaiah was placed on administrative hold. The project was suspended. 41 workers preparing to begin the interior restoration were told to stand by. The federal preservation grant funding a third of the budget had a clause requiring construction commencement within a defined window, and that window was not large. Brett came to Camille that evening and told her she needed to hold a press conference to go on record confirming that Isaiah had been aware of the bidding process all along and had turned against her when the marriage fell apart. He said it was the only way to protect herself and the business. He sat across from her in the office they had shared for 2 years and delivered this instruction with the same calm authority he had used for every other instruction he had given her. Camille listened. She looked at the man she had chosen over 12 years of marriage and tried to locate in his expression something that resembled concern for her. Specifically, not for the contract, not for the exposure, but for her. She could not find it. She told Brett she needed time to think. He told her there wasn't much time. She said she understood that and she walked out. She drove to Brett's apartment building, used the spare key he had given her, and went up. The apartment had been cleared, not cleaned, but deliberately emptied. A desk that had been covered in folders was bare. A filing cabinet drawer she knew had contained company documents was open and empty. On the counter, a phone charger and a coffee mug were the only signs that someone had recently lived there. She was standing in that emptied room when she noticed her own recording device on the floor beneath the desk, a small digital recorder she used in important internal meetings. A habit so ingrained she barely thought about it anymore. She had left it on the conference table during a strategy session weeks earlier and had forgotten to retrieve it in the rush of the contract announcement. Brett had apparently taken it lightly, intending to check whether it contained anything that could be used against him, but in his haste to clear out, he hadn't gotten around to listening to it. The device was still sealed in its case, untouched. She picked it up and pressed play. The audio was from a late evening session in the Davenport conference room. Brett and a financial consultant he had brought in from Houston. At one point, the consultant asked what would happen if the architect caused problems. Brett's answer was clear, unhurried, and recorded in its entirety. He had already handled the email documentation, he said. If things went sideways, the husband would take the fall. He said the two of them would destroy each other, and no one would be looking at the numbers by the time it was over. Camille sat down on the floor of the empty apartment with the recorder in her hand and stayed there for a long time. She thought about Isaiah walking out of their house carrying a box of blueprints and not looking back. She thought about the fact that everything Brett had told her about her husband, every quiet implication, every carefully placed observation had been engineering. She had been a tool in someone else's plan, and she had not seen it because she had been too busy believing that the story she was being handed was one she had chosen for herself. The trust had given Isaiah a deadline. If he did not voluntarily withdraw from the project by Friday, the board would move to terminate the grant and transfer the funds to an alternative site. The theater would be sold, and a development group that had been circling the property for years would acquire it. Isaiah was at his father's house when the notice arrived. He read it, set his phone face down on the kitchen table, and listened to the sound of Otis sanding a piece of reclaimed cypress in the next room, steady, unhurried, completely untroubled by the weight of the moment. He picked up his phone and called his attorney. He was not going to withdraw. Camille came to Otis Hollowell's house on a Friday morning, the last day before the trust's deadline. She drove herself. Isaiah noted that because she hadn't driven herself anywhere in over a year. She was wearing a gray coat he didn't recognize and carrying nothing except her keys and the small digital recorder which she set on the kitchen table between them before she sat down. Isaiah looked at the recorder and then at her. Camille had always maintained composure the way people do when composure is something they've worked for, rather than something that comes naturally, a controlled surface over a great deal of motion underneath. That morning, the surface was gone. She looked like someone who had been awake for a long time and had stopped trying to appear otherwise. She told him everything in the order it had happened. The 8 months with Brett. The access she had given him to the company's systems, to the household network, to the administrative credentials that had allowed him to copy Isaiah's files. The meetings with the private attorney, the divorce strategy, the plan to present Isaiah's contributions to Davenport Heritage Builders as informal and uncompensated. She said all of it plainly without the softening language people use when they are confessing something but still hoping to manage how it lands. Isaiah listened without interrupting. Otis had gone to his workshop when Camille arrived, and the sound of sanding drifted in from the back of the house, steady and indifferent. When she finished, Camille reached over and pressed play on the recorder. Isaiah listened to Brett's voice fill the small kitchen, the subcontractor structure, the financial consultant's question, Brett's answer in the unhurried tone of a man explaining something he found obvious. The part about the emails. The part about letting the two of them destroy each other while no one looked at the numbers. When the recording ended, Otis's sanding stopped in the next room as though he had been listening through the wall. Camille asked Isaiah if there was anything he could do to limit the exposure she was about to face. Isaiah was quiet for a moment before he answered. He told her he would not go out of his way to damage her, and he would not lie to protect her, and those two things were going to have to be enough. The truth was going to come out in full. The only question was whether she was the one who brought it forward or whether it arrived without her. Camille picked up the recorder and turned it over in her hands. Then she said quietly that she had always known who Isaiah was. Not his reputation, not his credentials, but the substance of him, the steadiness, the way he gave his attention to things that deserved it. She had known and had decided somewhere along the way that it was easier not to look directly at it. Isaiah didn't respond to that. It was simply true, and they both understood it, and some truths don't require anything added to them. She submitted the recording to the trust's legal counsel that afternoon, along with a written statement that confirmed the timeline of her relationship with Brett, the access she had granted him, and her knowledge that he had been investigating Isaiah's assets during the divorce planning period. The statement was complete and did not attempt to minimize her role. Isaiah's attorneys submitted the forensic analysis simultaneously, the metadata inconsistencies in the altered emails, the mail server headers that didn't match the timestamps that placed the alleged communications on dates when the relevant email client hadn't been in use on Isaiah's devices. The trust board convened an emergency session the following morning. It ran 4 hours. Regina Fontenot called Isaiah at 2 in the afternoon and told him the board had voted to restore his role and lift the administrative hold. The altered documents had been referred to the district attorney's office. She said she was sorry for the time it had taken to get there, and she said it in a way that made clear she meant it. Brett was apprehended at Louis Armstrong Airport the following Tuesday, 40 minutes before a flight to Cancun. 2 carry-on bags, a one-way ticket. The charges filed against him covered wire fraud, falsification of business records, and misappropriation of contracted funds. The 3 inflated subcontracts alone had directed just over $2.3 million into Chandler Field Management during the brief window between the contract award and the suspension. Federal investigators drawn in through the preservation grant component began pulling additional threads, and it became clear that the Marigny Crown project was not the first time Brett had constructed this particular architecture of fraud around a legitimate company's name. The restoration contract was reinstated with a revised governance structure. Davenport Heritage Builders remained the construction contractor, but was placed under the oversight of an independent project board. Camille stepped down as CEO, not because she was required to, though the pressure was considerable, but because she concluded that the company's survival required it. She sold a portion of her equity stake to cover outstanding liabilities and protect the jobs of employees who had had nothing to do with any of it. She retained a minority interest and a board seat reduced in authority, but not entirely removed, which was a harder outcome to accept than a clean break would have been, and probably the right one for exactly that reason. Isaiah's divorce settlement was handled over several weeks. He took what was genuinely his portion of the shared property at fair market value and the full intellectual property rights to every design document, sketch, and research file that had originated in his work. He did not pursue punitive claims. He signed the final papers on a Thursday and drove back to Otis's house and had dinner with his father, and that was the end of 12 years. Camille called him once after the papers were signed. She said she had been going back through things, through the early years, through everything, and she wanted him to know she understood now what she had been given and what she had done with it. She asked if there was any possibility of starting over. Isaiah told her no, and he told her why the problem had never been that she didn't know he was accomplished. The problem was that she had stopped respecting him when she thought he wasn't. That was the thing he could not rebuild on, and both of them knew in the quiet after he said it that she understood exactly what he meant. The Marigny Crown Theater reopened on a Saturday in late spring, 18 months after the contract had been awarded and suspended and restored. The ceremony was held on the sidewalk outside first because the building needed to be seen from the street before it could be entered. The cleaned limestone facade, the restored ironwork, the marquee letters reset in their original font. Neighbors who had walked past the boarded-up shell for years stood on the opposite curb and looked at it. Most of them were quiet in the way that people are quiet when a city gives something back they had assumed was gone for good. Inside, the arched ceiling had been repaired using lime plaster mixed to match the original composition. The mahogany balconies had been restored by craftsmen, two of whom Otis had known for decades. The mosaic floor in the main lobby, hand-laid ceramic tiles in a pattern documented in photographs from the building's opening night, had been rebuilt tile by tile over 8 months. The stage, the proscenium plasterwork, the fly system above the stage, all of it returned to what it had actually been, not an interpretation, not a modernized approximation. The thing itself recovered. A local television crew was there for the ceremony. When the reporter asked Isaiah how it felt to see the building finished, he redirected the question toward the craftsmen near the entrance, toward the historians who had provided the archival documentation, toward the residents who had shown up to the Trust's public meetings for 2 years to insist that this building mattered. He understood, as he had always understood, that a restoration was not the work of one person's vision. It was the work of many people agreeing against the pressure of time and money and entropy that something was worth saving. Camille was seated toward the back of the gathered crowd. She had come because she felt it was right to see it finished. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began moving inside, she made her way over to Isaiah. They did not embrace. She extended her hand, and he shook it less than what they had been, and more than it might have been, and therefore accurate. She told him it was extraordinary. He said he thought so too. Then she walked back into the crowd, and he let her go. After the ceremony, Isaiah walked out to the sidewalk where Otis was standing, looking up at the marquee hands in his jacket pockets, doing the thing he did when he was satisfied, not quite smiling, but settled. Isaiah stood beside him. The street lights had come on and the building was lit from below, and it looked in that light like something that had always been there and always would be, which was precisely what it was supposed to look like. Otis asked him how it felt being seen like this, the coverage, the city finally knowing what his son had been doing all along. Isaiah looked up at the building for a while before he answered. He said that for a long time he had believed that being unseen was the cost of loving someone who needed more room than he did. He had told himself that was generosity when really it was something closer to disappearance, a slow erasure he had participated in because he hadn't known how to stop it without losing what he thought he had. Being here tonight, he said, wasn't about being seen by anyone in particular. It was about having stopped hiding. Those were two different things, and he had spent a long time confusing them. Otis nodded and kept looking at the marquee. Then he said he was cold and asked if they were going inside to watch the performance. Isaiah said yes. They went in through the main entrance past the mosaic floor and beneath the restored arch and found 2 seats near the back where they could see the full sweep of the ceiling. The lights went down slowly, gradually enough that you don't notice the darkness arriving until you're already in it, looking toward the stage waiting for something to begin. Isaiah sat in the dark and listened to the building settle around him, and he felt without needing to name it precisely that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The Marini crown had been worth saving because its foundation was still sound. That was true of the building. It had not been true of his marriage, and Isaiah had made his peace with knowing the difference. Some things you restore, some things you release. The wisdom is in knowing which is which, and then once you know, finding the courage to act on it. Isaiah's value was never created on the day the city finally saw him. It existed in every quiet hour he gave without asking for acknowledgement, in every sacrifice he made without keeping score. The tragedy was not that Camille failed to see it. The tragedy was that she only truly looked after the world told her where to direct her eyes. If there's one thing this